summer 1917. Instead of returning to Enniscorthy, however, Milo was set up with Mrs. Brewer again, who came to the Ashby house and taught her. She was nearly 14 now, and not in need of education, but Harold Ashby had insisted. So when she was not learning, Milo was up at Downton Abbey with Ernest, who, though treating her no differently, has changed from what Milo could see. Something was different with him, and her father was glad she had not gone back. Milo would have had to travel alone, and crossing the Irish Sea to Dublin but did not go back was deemed by Mr. Ashby too risky for a young child. Republicanism is in the air, she had overheard him tell Ernest, and with the war, there is far too much danger for her. So Milo was to go in the future, and her father had written to her grandmother, which suited Milo, for she had learned about wiring up her father's devices. Mrs. Hughes had an electrical toaster, which Milo had the privilege of demonstrating to her how it worked, while Ernest and Harold Ashby, Mr. Carson and his lordship looked on. "You head home," Mr. Ashby told Milo after the success of the toaster, who then coughed and spluttered, and was supported by Ernest, who went into a long conversation with him. Her brother brought their father home, and Thomas had come too. She overheard her friend tell Ernest that Mr. Ashby should go to see Dr. Clarkson, or he should be sent for tuberculum, I should say, Thomas told him, and Milo listened as the front door of the Ashbys' home opened. "I will get Dr. Clarkson," Ernest agreed, and there was a long silence before her brother added, "and are you?" So Milo left the family home the next day with a message for Dr. Clarkson, who went immediately back to see her father. Ernest told her she had to stay with him. "Come with me," Thomas said, "and you can watch some of the hospital work I do." And she watched, and saw, as Thomas and Lady Sybil tended the wounded, allowing them to be comfortable, or administered medication, while Mrs. Crawley diagnosed and ordered continuation of treatment or a change in it. "Whatever are you thinking?" Thomas asked, when he saw Milo watch what was going on. And she was thinking, how it was that some of the officers there seemed well enough to walk but screamed and cried for apparently no reason. Why did some parts of the body heal perfectly, but others did not? Why some injuries caused immediate death, but others made men linger and the body recover? "It's a bit like an electrical circuit," she told him. "Something inside a body tells it what to be or to do. If some of the edges get damaged they can repair again, but if it's a big part, the system is ruined. But with an electrical circuit, you can get more wires and make a new circuit. Not so a body. Not so the body that's damaged, but a new body, a baby, made of new parts, like the new circuit has new components." "She's a strange one," Thomas told Ernest after they had relieved one another of the built-up tension of the day. "It seems the more she gets educated, the stranger they become. She will have to marry, I shouldn't wonder, and she would have to give all of this thinking up." "I cannot see Milo being happy with that," Thomas told him. "It seems like the very essence of her is wrapped up in her thoughts." "And what good will that do?" Ernest snapped to Thomas, though Thomas knew it wasn't at him, but at the world, for he continued, "She cannot enroll at a university if she tries to make a living with father. She would put herself at risk of a good marriage." "You sound like those indoors," Thomas told him. "Aren't there any women scientists?" "You told me of one in Paris, Madame Curie." Suddenly Ernest's hostility evaporated. Even then, as a poor Polish woman, she had to marry a French scientist just to be recognized, and then she was given research work to do that was deemed irrelevant. Ernest laughed, and Thomas looked at him. But they weren't laughing when she made her discovery, radioactivity. It is what Hans Geiger was working on, and Röntgen. But we cannot even communicate with those great minds because of the war, because they're German. Even one of our colleagues was stuck in Berlin when war was declared. "And what happened to him?" Thomas asked, feeling across for Ernest's hand. "Chadwick, I believe he has been interned. If the war takes a bloody turn, he may be forced to work for the enemy, though I know him to be a patriot and would never betray any secret which would harm our country. Dear James would rather die first." "Dear James?" Ernest snorted with laughter at Thomas's indignant tone. "Not him, he has no interest like that." Ernest sighed. "I do wish the war could be brought to an end. and I can go back to university and continue with our work. And Milo could go to Paris and marry a scientist, Thomas told Ernest, and they kissed, and touched and loved one another again. 88,888,888 It seems to be going wrong, Milo dear, Mrs. Hughes told her one morning when she had come to help Ernest with the electrical wiring that was going to be in the servants' bedrooms. Sometimes when I put it on, I get bread out again. Sometimes the toast is burned to a crisp. Within a few minutes, the electrical toaster was in pieces on the table in Mrs. Hughes' parlor. Milo looked at each of the pieces. I'll rewire it, she told the housekeeper. It could do with some thicker wire, it's getting too hot. And Milo went off to the generator building to get a section of it from the discarded pieces that her brother kept. On the way, she was approached by a man, in uniform, using crutches. He smiled to her. I have seen you about, with your brother? Milo frowned at him. She didn't know him, he was a stranger to her. Oh, I do apologize, the officer said. Hardcastle, Captain George Hardcastle. He held out a hand. Milo looked at it, and back to the man. I worked with your brother, at the trenches. He was under my command for a while. Ernest? She asked. Yes, Ernest, he told her. Sergeant Ernest, Ashby, Milo finished. Yes, Captain Hardcastle agreed. And he had been exempted from the war for some time for his research work at Cambridge. I just wanted to say I think it is marvelous that a young lady such as yourself could do such technical things. To fit electrical lights into the gas fittings, now, that takes some skill. He put out a hand again. Milo ignored it. And, conjuring up the words she reasoned that she needed now, said, Thank you, Captain Hardcastle. It was a pleasure to meet you, and without waiting for a reply, turned and scuttled off to the generator building and stayed there for several hours while Mrs. Hughes looked mournfully at her toaster and wondered if Milo would ever come back. But she did, later that afternoon, feeling uneasy about her interaction with the captain, aware that she should not be speaking to him alone, and Milo had contemplated that operative word, for other people had been about them. She had waited until she saw the courtyard was clear before crossing back to the kitchens again. It should not be a problem any longer, Milo told Mrs. Hughes. She looked around the parlor. My father has other electrical devices for sale, she furthered. Mrs. Hughes smiled. A proper little saleswoman, she told Milo. No, thought Milo, just an observation. But she knew it was impolite to correct Mrs. Hughes. He is working on a cold box, one which means its contents will stay cold as long as you like. Milk, for example. We have kept milk cold in the cold box. Mrs. Doyle thinks it's a marvel. And it does not spoil. It will keep good for 2 days, Milo told her. A cold box, Mrs. Hughes sighed. What a marvel. I should not be speaking to you, Milo told Captain Hardcastle when he approached her again as she made across the courtyard to find Ernest. Oh indeed, the captain smiled. I do apologize. I was just interested in the work you are doing. Milo felt awkward. She wanted to speak to the man about her work, but he had found her again when she was alone, and she knew she must not talk to him. However, the problem was solved when Thomas approached them both and demanded to know his name and rank. It's all right, Milo, Thomas told her. Ernest has just gone back to the generator room. Join him there and I will walk you home. And Milo went quickly, the conversation behind her fading into the evening. I should report you, Thomas told Captain Hardcastle, whose face had hardened at the interruption. She is only 13 years old. Do you wish me to tell her father and her brother? Do you wish me to tell your major? 13? Oh, I did not know, and I do not expect to hear you have spoken to her again. You are under my care, Captain Hardcastle. The man clutched his crutches. Is that a threat, Sergeant Barrow? It is a promise, Captain Hardcastle. And Thomas watched the captain retreat, before turning. He was about to go to find Milo when he saw Tom Branson standing there. He was doing no harm. I've seen him talk to her before. Oh, you have you? Nothing seemed amiss. This coming from a man who took Lady Sybil to the by-electrian in Ripon when violence broke out. The conflict began between the two men, which troubled Milo, who ran back home, back to her father and Mrs. Doyle and peace and quiet. Because she had found out something about Ernest which, Milo knew, would make Thomas frown and be short with her. But she did not know whether Thomas knew yet that Ernest had to go back to the front, for the next day, a wounded Matthew Crawley arrived to be nursed at Downton Abbey. 1918. We offer you the greatest of thanks for the contribution Ernest made to the estate, Lord Grantham told Harold Ashby, who he had asked to call on him in December. But it was not of her brother that Milo thought as she was shown in, as an invited guest, through the front door. It was the lack of beds, of nurses, of Dr. Clarkson and Sergeant Barrow. Thomas had returned to being first footman and the library had become the library again. It took all of her father's effort not to cough prolifically before the Earl, and their visit proved short, ending in an invitation for Milo that she should come back when she liked. And I would value your contribution to the electrical appliances, Lord Grantham told her. Mrs. Hughes was delighted to hear of the icebox. She wonders whether an iron could be wired electrically to save maids' arms. I am sure that could be investigated, Mr. Ashby managed, before begging for forgiveness for his cough. Lord Grantham looked to Milo. Yes, Lord Grantham, Milo agreed. I will help my father with it, for she has been a boon, Mr. Ashby, Lord Grantham told Harold Ashby. We now have electricity in all tenant farmers' cottages. So long as she has been no trouble, Mr. Ashby said, giving a severe look to Milo. Indeed not, Lord Grantham told him, smiling to Milo. She is 14 and can do all of that. He strode to the door. At once, Carson opened it so that Mr. Ashby and Milo could leave. And I do hope that you receive good news, and that your son walks through your front door soon. So did Milo. She returned with her father, through the front door of Downton Abbey, and into the car that Lord Grantham had summoned for them. Wordlessly, Tom held open the doors and he drove them in silence to Downton Village. Milo, Mr. Ashby told his daughter, when they had alighted and the car had driven away. I have business here in the village. Will you walk home, my darling, and ask Mrs. Doyle to get the dinner on, as we are back so soon? And you may make a start on tidying Ernest's notes, and making a copy of them. Either with him, or without him, they need to be sent to his professor at Cambridge. And, after being prescribed tablets for his chest, Harold Ashby began to discuss with Dr. Clarkson his concerns for Milo. She is so dreamy, lost in thought. But when I talk to her, she answers me brightly, and with detail. How was in school? Dr. Clarkson asked. Did she thrive? Milo never went to school, Ernest and I taught her. And the conversation wound over Milo's faults, at climbing, and interest, deep interest, in particular thing, and her need to know the answers in her mind. How she did not seem very interested in children of her own age, and even at her aunt's she had been isolated. And what about what she can do? Asked Dr. Clarkson, kindly. This brought a coughing fit to Mr. Ashby, who tried to form his words. None as will be, cough, useful in a, cough, woman, Harold Ashby told the doctor. Yet, Dr. Clarkson thought, he had seen Melusina Ashby and had witnessed her qualities. Not bald silence but a mind full of thoughts. Not lonely, but garnered friendships from people of her intellectual equal. He watched Mr. Ashby leave and considered that, as the girl was still to be a feature at Downton Abbey, that he would leave a few words in the ear of Mrs. Crawley. 88,888,888. What are you thinking about, Thomas Barrow asked Milo, when he found her in the electricity generator. It was 2 weeks before Christmas, but the weather was mild and she had brought up the prototype iron. Not that Mrs. Hughes seemed that keen. Oh, she had said the usual encouraging words and had thanked Milo, but Downton's housekeeper had eyed Milo's prototype electric iron with suspicion, and as she left, Milo heard Mrs. Hughes say to Mr. Carson that it was a confounded contraption. And Milo felt cold as she stepped out through the kitchen, so she crossed to the nearest place she knew which would warm her up before she walked home. But it was not empty. Eyes closed, on a chair near the generator, Thomas sat. He opened his eyes when he saw Milo. I miss him, she told him, as she sat on the bed he and Ernest had often shared. It was just a mattress now, The linen long returned to the house, and Thomas reached for her hand. I expect him to walk through the courtyard, with that book he always had, with his measurements in, Thomas told her. You behind him. You talk as if he were dead, Milo told him, a severity in her voice. Thomas turned to her. Every time he left, for Manchester, for Cambridge, it was like a death to me, he told her, stroking her hand. That is all I meant. Many soldiers are displaced, and are still returning home. And it was the white feather that did it, Thomas thought to himself. He strongly suspected who had sent it to him, but he had no proof. Come on then, what have you to tell me? And Milo told him a lot, of the cottage's wiring, of her prototype iron, of their visit to Lord Grantham. And a funny thing, Milo told him. Go on, Thomas encouraged. When I was leaving tonight, a maid went into the Earl's bedroom. Oh? Thomas asked. Why was that funny? Because she was holding hands with Lord Grantham. It was good to tell me, Thomas told Milo, before turning the conversation to other things, not forgetting, however, to store that information in his memory. 88,888,888. Whether it was because of Ernest not being with them, or it being winter, or Thomas being less strict as he had once been, he did not shoo her back home that night, as winter set in and snow began to fall in the landscape around them. Thomas, instead, made up the bed for Milo and had sat in the chair, watching her, thinking. What's a relay race? Milo asked him, as dawn broke, and Thomas told her that he was walking her home. It's a sport, Thomas told her. Like a running race. But there are 4 people. They stand at various parts of the track, and, when the first one runs, he takes the baton, then passes it to the second relayer, who runs to the third, and so on. He smiled, as the birds filled the crisp air with tinkling song. I ran one, once, at school. We won. My name's on the Salford Boys' School trophy to this day. Oh, I wondered, Milo said, turning her head to the sunrise, thinking. Then, as they walked in silence to the bridge, over which Downton village lay, she looked back to Thomas. Cousin Guglielmo told me that he thinks radio could be made longer distance if it could be sent like a relay race. One signal passing to a receiver, then another, all the way. Just before you go home, I need to just pay a visit to the garages over here. And Milo waited, outside, as she saw Thomas opening the doors and moving things around inside. Don't tell, Thomas told her, as he closed up again. I won't tell, she promises, though I do not know what you were doing. Don't tell I have this copper and a coil and a magnet from the generator building for my own and an electrical generator. And when Mr. Ashby opened the door instead of Mrs. Doyle, Milo thought she was going to be in trouble, but Harold Ashby smiled widely. Mr. Ashby, began Thomas. You took the liberty of bringing me Lucina home to me, Mr. Ashby told him, as he ushered Milo inside. I saw her, coming up the lane with you, he added, smiling. It is so good to see my daughter smile, she so rarely does. Good day, Mr. Ashby, Thomas said to Ernest's father, removing his hat and nodding to him. May I trespass on your good nature further, Mr. Barrow, on behalf of Milo, that she may call on you when she is in receipt of the news I have for her, delivered last night? And Thomas knew, without being told by Harold Ashby, that the telegram in the man's hand would contain news of the death of his lover. You may, Thomas said, his throat tight, and he nodded to Mr. Ashby once more, before turning back to Downton Abbey. Thomas managed all of the day to carry out his duties, and when it came to retire for the night he slipped out of the kitchen door and out over to the generator building. Only when he had barred the door from the inside did Thomas Barrow give in to self-indulgence and sobbed until he could cry no more.